Every year on Memorial Day, at exactly 10 minutes before the ceremony began, an old man walked into the VFW post on Route 9 outside of Brattleboro, Vermont, found the same chair at the same table near the back wall, and sat there alone until the ceremony ended and most everyone else had gone home. This had been happening for as long as anyone currently active at the post could remember, which was a span of at least 15 years for some of the longer-tenured members, and probably longer than that, because the older members who might have remembered the beginning of the pattern had themselves passed on, leaving behind only the pattern itself unexplained, like a ritual whose original meaning had been lost to everyone except the man performing it. His name was Walter Atterson. He was 91 years old. He had served in the Korean War. This much the post knew because it was on the membership records. The basic facts of his service inscribed on a card that had been updated periodically over decades, but that contained nothing beyond name, rank, branch, dates of service, and the address where he could be reached, which for the last 22 years had been a small house on Pleasant Street that he had lived in alone since his wife, Doris, died of cancer. He had 2 grown children, a son in Arizona and a daughter in Massachusetts, neither of whom lived close enough to visit often, both of whom called regularly and worried. In the specific way adult children worry about an aging parent who insists, every time the subject comes up, that he is perfectly fine on his own. He came to the post exactly once a year, on Memorial Day and at no other time. He did not attend the monthly meetings. He did not come to the Friday fish fries that the post ran as a fundraiser. He did not participate in the honor guard that performed military funeral services for deceased veterans in the area, an activity that many of the post's older members considered one of their most important ongoing duties. He simply appeared on Memorial Day, sat alone at the back table, and left. The post's current commander, a woman named Diane Castellano, who had served 2 tours in Iraq, the second of which had ended with a Purple Heart and a slow recovery that had taken the better part of a year, and who had been running the Brattleboro post for the past 4 years, had noticed Walter Atterson her first year in the role and had asked several of the longer-standing members about him. The answers she got were vague and inconsistent. Someone said he had been part of the post decades ago and had simply stopped participating after some falling out nobody could quite remember the details of. Someone else said they thought it had to do with something that happened during his service, something he had never talked about, the kind of thing that sometimes made men withdraw entirely from anything that reminded them of that period of their lives. A third member, an old-timer named Pruitt, who had himself been at the post for almost 40 years, said only that Walter Atterson came once a year because once a year was apparently what he could manage, and that the post had long ago decided not to push him for more than that on the theory that showing up at all, even just once a year, even just to sit alone, was its own kind of participation that deserved to be respected rather than interrogated. Diane had accepted this explanation more or less for 3 years. She had made a point, each Memorial Day, of greeting Walter when he came in, a brief handshake, a thank you for his service, the standard exchange that happened with every veteran who walked through the door on that particular day. Walter had always been polite in response, brief but not cold, the responses of a man who had clearly developed over many years a practiced way of accepting gratitude without it requiring him to open up any further than the gratitude itself demanded. This year, the 4th Memorial Day of Diane's tenure as commander, something different happened. Though it began in a way that seemed, at first, almost accidental. The ceremony had run long that year. The keynote speaker, a state representative who had a tendency toward extended remarks, had gone well past his allotted time, and by the time the wreath had been laid and the rifle volley fired and the bugler had finished playing taps, the gathering that usually dispersed within 20 minutes had instead lingered for almost an hour. People standing in clusters in the parking lot and the function hall, the specific reluctance to leave that sometimes follows a ceremony that has moved people more than they expected. Diane, moving through the hall, checking on various logistics, the food table, the chairs that needed folding, the sound equipment that needed to be put away, found herself almost by accident, near the back table where Walter Atterson sat alone, as he always did, waiting for the room to empty enough that he could leave without having to navigate through crowds of people, a pattern Diane had noticed over the previous 3 years, but had never directly remarked on. This year, because the ceremony had run long and because the crowd was thinning more slowly than usual, Diane found herself with a few unstructured minutes and no immediate task pulling her elsewhere. And she made a decision she had been considering, in some unformed way, for the past 3 years without ever quite committing to it. She pulled out the chair across from Walter and sat down. He looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was clearly surprised. The expression of a man whose routine had just been altered in a way he had not anticipated and was not entirely sure how to respond to. Diane said she hoped she wasn't intruding. Walter said she wasn't, in the careful neutral tone he used for most exchanges at the post, the tone that gave away nothing about whether he meant it or was simply being polite. She sat with him for a moment in silence, not entirely sure how to proceed, aware that she was venturing into territory that the post's unofficial understanding had suggested she should avoid. But she had been thinking for 3 years about the specific loneliness of a man who came once a year to sit by himself in a room full of people who had served the same country he had. And she found, in this particular extended afternoon with no urgent task pulling her away, that she did not want to simply let the moment pass the way it had passed 3 times before. She said, gently, that she had noticed he came every year, just for this one day, and she asked, as carefully as she could manage, why this particular day mattered to him when the rest of the post's activities apparently did not. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Diane began to think she had overstepped, that she should apologize and excuse herself, and let the established pattern of respectful non-inquiry continue as it had for as long as anyone could remember. Then, Walter said that he came on Memorial Day because Memorial Day was the only day that was actually about the dead rather than about the living, and that this distinction mattered to him in a way he had never adequately explained to anyone, including for many years himself. Diane asked what he meant. Walter looked at the wreath that had been laid that morning, still visible through the open doors of the hall, resting against the small memorial stone in the courtyard outside, the late spring sunlight catching the edge of the ribbon tied around it. He said that most of what happened at the post, the meetings, the fish fries, the social events, the things that brought veterans together to share stories and support each other, were valuable things, important things, things he did not begrudge anyone for valuing. But he said they were, in his own private accounting, activities for the living, ways for men and women who had survived their service to build community with other survivors, and that this was not, for reasons he had carried for 70 years without finding adequate words for, something he felt he had the right to participate in. Diane asked him, gently, why not? Walter was quiet again, longer this time. Then he began to tell her about December of 1950, about a position near the Chosin Reservoir, about a unit of 41 men under conditions that had, in the 70 years since, become a kind of historical shorthand for a specific category of suffering. Extreme cold combined with overwhelming enemy numbers combined with the particular chaos of a retreat under fire. He told her, in a voice that had clearly told this story to almost no one in 70 years, about a decision he had made during a specific 6 minutes of that engagement. A decision involving which of 2 positions to reinforce first, a decision that had seemed, in the moment, like the only reasonable choice available to a 21-year-old corporal operating with incomplete information under conditions of extreme stress, radio communications failing, visibility reduced to almost nothing in the blowing snow, and that had resulted, as a direct consequence of which position got reinforced and which did not, in the deaths of 6 men in his unit, men whose names he still knew, men he could still, 70 years later, describe in physical detail the specific way each of them had looked, the specific things each of them had talked about in the days before the engagement, the particular sound of one man's laugh that Walter said he still heard sometimes unprompted, decades later, in quiet moments when his mind wandered somewhere it was not supposed to go. He said he had spent 70 years understanding, in the rational and intellectual part of his mind, that the decision had been reasonable given the information available at the time, that he had not been negligent, that any number of qualified officers reviewing the same decision with the same information would likely have made the same choice, that he had, in fact, been formally commended rather than blamed for his conduct during the engagement. He said that none of this rational understanding had ever been able to reach the other part of his mind, the part that had spent 70 years carrying the specific weight of 6 names and 6 faces, and the persistent, irrational, but utterly unmovable conviction that he did not have the right to celebrate having survived something that had killed men he had been responsible for. He said that Memorial Day, specifically, was the one day he allowed himself to come to the post, because Memorial Day was about honoring the dead rather than celebrating the living, and that this distinction, however arbitrary it might seem to anyone else, was the only framework within which he had been able to justify his own presence in a space dedicated to veterans, a framework in which he was there to honor 6 men rather than to participate in something that felt, on every other day of the year, like claiming membership in a fellowship he had forfeited his right to 70 years earlier on a frozen hillside in Korea. He said he had built this rule for himself sometime in his 30s, after years of trying and failing to attend the post the way other men did, and that once the rule was in place, it had simply become the architecture of his life, unquestioned in the way that very old habits eventually stop feeling like choices at all. Diane sat with this for a long time after Walter finished speaking. She had heard in her own years of service and in her years running the post a great many stories of guilt and loss carried by veterans across decades, but there was something in the specific architecture of Walter's guilt, the precise and carefully maintained boundary he had built around himself, the once-a-year exception he had carved out and defended for 70 years, that struck her with a particular force. The late afternoon light moving slowly across the empty function hall, the last few stragglers from the ceremony finally clearing out of the parking lot outside. She said carefully that she understood why he felt the way he felt, but that she wanted to offer him a different way of looking at it, if he would allow her to. Walter said he would listen. She said that in her own experience, both in combat and in the decades since, the men and women who carried this specific kind of weight, the weight of decisions made under impossible conditions that had resulted in loss, were almost never the men and women who deserved to carry it in the way they carried it. She said that the willingness to take on that weight, to hold oneself to an impossibly high standard of responsibility for outcomes that were never fully within anyone's control, was itself a kind of evidence of character, the very character that made someone fit to be honored rather than excluded. She said that the men he had lost would not, in her assessment, want him spending 70 years exiling himself from the company of his fellow veterans on their behalf, that this was not what honoring the dead actually required, that there was a difference between remembering someone and using their memory as a permanent sentence against your own right to community and connection. Walter listened to this without responding immediately. Diane did not push further. She understood from her own experience with grief that did not resolve cleanly, that this kind of conversation could not be concluded through argument, that what she had offered was simply a perspective Walter could choose to sit with or set aside, not a case she could win through better reasoning. They sat together for a while longer, the hall mostly empty now, the afternoon light slanting through the windows in the specific way of late spring afternoons. Diane asked eventually if Walter would be willing to tell her the names of the 6 men, and he did slowly, each name followed by a brief detail, the way he had described them earlier but more deliberately now, as if he were formally introducing them to someone for the first time in many years. Diane said she would like to do something. If Walter was willing, and she described an idea that had come to her while he was talking, not fully formed but clear enough in its essential shape, that the post maintain a small dedicated plaque in the function hall with the 6 names, separate from the general memorial that already existed, something specifically for Walter's unit, something that would exist whether or not Walter himself was there to see it, a permanent acknowledgement that did not depend on his annual once-a-year visit to function. Walter was quiet for a long time after she described this. Then he said he would like that. He said it in a voice that carried more emotion than anything he had said up to that point. the specific quality of a man who had spent 70 years trying to manage an impossible weight through private discipline and was now being offered, for the first time, the possibility of sharing some portion of that weight with people who wanted to help him carry it. The plaque was made over the following 2 months. A simple bronze rectangle with the 6 names and the dates and a brief inscription that Diane had worked out with Walter's input. Careful and direct, naming the unit and the engagement without elaborate language. The kind of plain, factual memorial that Walter said felt right to him, that did not try to make meaning out of something he had spent 70 years understanding, did not resolve into easy meaning. It was installed in July, in a small ceremony that Diane had deliberately kept low-key, understanding that Walter would not have wanted, and would likely not have attended, anything elaborate. A handful of Post members were present, along with Walter's daughter, who had driven up from Massachusetts after Walter, in a phone call 2 weeks earlier, had told her for the first time in her entire life the actual story behind the only day of the year he had ever visited the Post. Walter stood in front of the plaque for a long time after it was unveiled, reading the 6 names slowly, his daughter's hand resting on his shoulder. And several of the Post members who were present later told Diane that they had never seen Walter Atterson's face look the way it looked in that moment. A complicated mixture of grief and something that might have been relief. The specific expression of a man setting down, even partially, a weight he had carried alone for 7 decades. What happened after the plaque was something Diane had not specifically anticipated, but that, in retrospect, seemed almost inevitable. Walter began coming to the Post more than once a year. Not frequently, not transformed overnight into a regular fixture at every meeting and fish fry, but gradually, over the following year, he began appearing perhaps once a month, sitting initially at the same back table he had always favored but engaging, slowly, in actual conversation with the other members who approached him, conversations that built, slowly, into something like the community membership he had denied himself for 7 decades. He began, eventually, to talk to younger veterans at the Post, men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and who were carrying their own versions of the weight Walter had carried since Korea, the specific guilt of decisions made under impossible conditions, the specific isolation that this kind of guilt could produce. Walter, who had spent 70 years unable to talk about his own experience to almost anyone, found that he had, somewhere in the process of finally talking about it to Diane and seeing the plaque installed, developed an unexpected capacity to talk about it to others, particularly to younger veterans who were clearly struggling with their own versions of the same architecture of guilt he understood. Intimately, Diane watched this happen, over the following 2 years with a kind of quiet amazement. The specific transformation of a man who had spent 70 years isolated by a private conviction into someone who had become, gradually and without anyone formally assigning him the role, one of the Post's most effective informal counselors for younger veterans struggling with combat guilt, a man whose authority on the subject came not from any formal training, but from the simple and devastating fact that he had lived inside exactly the thing he was now helping others survive. She found herself more than once simply directing newer members toward the back table where Walter now sat more openly, no longer hiding in the corner, but positioned, almost deliberately, where anyone who needed him could find him. A young veteran named Marcus Oyeleran, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been struggling, in the 2 years since his return, with guilt over a decision he had made during an ambush that had resulted in the death of a soldier under his command, found his way to Walter through a chance conversation at one of the Post's monthly meetings, a conversation that began because Marcus had noticed the plaque and asked about it, not knowing the full story, simply curious about the 6 names and the specific unit designation. Walter told him the story, the same story he had told Diane 2 years earlier, and Marcus, listening, found himself, for the first time since returning from his 2nd deployment, talking to someone who understood, not abstractly but specifically and completely, the exact shape of what he was carrying. They talked for 3 hours that evening, long after the formal meeting had ended. Two men separated by 70 years and two different wars, but connected by an experience that turned out, in its essential architecture, to be devastatingly similar across that distance. Marcus began coming to the post regularly after that conversation, in significant part because of his relationship with Walter, and over the following year, he found, with Walter's ongoing support and the structure the post provided, that the weight he had been carrying alone for 2 years became, gradually, something he could carry differently, something that did not require the same isolation Walter had imposed on himself for 7 decades. He eventually reconnected with the family of the soldier he had lost, a connection he had avoided for 2 years, out of the same conviction Walter had carried for 70, and found, to his surprise, that the soldier's mother had been hoping to hear from him the entire time, that she did not blame him the way he had assumed she must, that she simply wanted to know her son had served alongside someone who had cared about him as deeply as Marcus clearly had. 3 years after the first conversation in the function hall, on a Memorial Day that fell almost exactly to the day on the anniversary of that conversation, with the room fuller than it had been in years, word having spread informally through the community about what had happened with Walter and the plaque, Diane stood at the front of the post's function hall to deliver brief remarks before the ceremony moved outside to the memorial. She had not planned, originally, to mention Walter specifically, but found, looking out at the assembled crowd, that she could not let the day pass without acknowledging what had happened in this room 3 years earlier. She told the story, with Walter's permission, given the week before, not in full detail, but in its essential shape. A man who had carried an impossible weight alone for 70 years, who had allowed himself 1 day a year to be present among his fellow veterans because that was the only framework within which he could justify his own presence, and who had, through a chance conversation that neither of them had planned, found a way to set down at least part of that weight and discovered, in the process, an unexpected capacity to help others carry their own versions of it. Walter sat in the audience during these remarks, not at the back table this year, but in the second row, surrounded by post members who had become, over 3 years, genuine friends rather than strangers he tolerated once annually. When Diane finished speaking, the room was quiet for a moment, and then Walter stood, slowly, with the particular careful movement of a 94-year-old man, and walked to the front of the hall. He did not give a speech. He was not a man given to speeches, and everyone in the room understood this about him well enough by now not to expect one. He simply stood at the front of the room, steadied himself with one hand on the podium, and said that he wanted to thank Diane Castellano for asking him a question 70 years too late, but exactly when he needed it asked, and that he wanted to thank the Post for building a plaque that had given 6 men a permanent place in a room that, for 70 years, he had only allowed himself to enter once a year on their behalf. He said he had spent 7 decades believing that honoring the dead meant exiling himself from the living, and that he had been wrong and that he was grateful, more grateful than he had words to properly express, for the people who had shown him that. Before you go, I want to leave you with the specific shape of what Walter Atterson carried and what it cost him. 70 years of exile from a community he had every right to belong to, built on a private conviction that no amount of rational argument could dislodge on its own. A conviction that survived decades of intellectual understanding, because intellectual understanding was never the part of him that needed reaching, until someone simply sat down across from him and asked, gently and without judgment, why? Diane did not fix Walter Atterson. She did not argue him out of 70 years of guilt in a single afternoon. She simply made space for him to say the thing he had been carrying alone, and that space turned out to be enough to begin a process that took years to unfold, but that ultimately gave Walter back something he had denied himself for most of his adult life. Somewhere near you today, there may be a Walter Atterson, someone who has built a quiet private exile around themselves for reasons that seem, to them, entirely justified, sitting at their own version of the back table once a year or once a decade or simply once. And that exile might dissolve, at least partially, if someone simply asked why with patience and without pushing for more than the person is ready to give. Tell me in the comments, have you ever asked someone the question that finally let them put something down? Or has someone asked you? I want to hear it. Share this today with someone who needs to know that it is never too late to ask. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.